The Forgotten Field. Chapter 3, The First Harvest. Autumn arrived slowly. The heat of summer began to fade, replaced by cool mornings and golden afternoons. The leaves on the trees surrounding the farm started changing colors, painting the landscape with shades of red, orange, and gold. For Ethan Carter, the changing season meant something even more important. It was time to plant. For months, he had spent every waking hour repairing, rebuilding, and preparing the land. The storm had tested him. The cleanup had exhausted him. Yet somehow, the farm was standing stronger than before. Now came the moment that would determine whether all that work had been worth it. The first harvest. Not a large one. Not enough to make him rich. Just enough to prove the farm could produce again. As sunrise painted the horizon, Ethan climbed into his grandfather's old tractor. The engine rumbled to life. A familiar sound echoed across the fields. He smiled. Months earlier, that tractor had been silent. Now it was carrying him toward the future. The freshly prepared field stretched before him. It wasn't perfect. Rocks still appeared here and there. Some areas needed improvement, but it was ready. For the first time in nearly 20 years, seeds would return to the forgotten field. Ethan lowered the planter and began moving forward. Row after row, hour after hour, the tractor crawled across the land. Behind it, seeds disappeared into the soil. Tiny seeds, almost invisible, yet each one carried possibility. Each one represented faith. Faith that the work mattered. Faith that the future could be better. Faith that growth was coming, even when it couldn't yet be seen. Weeks passed. Every morning, Ethan inspected the fields. At first, nothing happened. The ground remained unchanged. Brown dirt stretched endlessly across the property. Days became frustrating. He had worked so hard, yet there were no visible results. One morning, he stood beside Carl Henderson at the edge of the field. "Maybe I planted too late," Ethan said. Carl chuckled. "You planted exactly when you should have." "Then where are they?" Carl pointed toward the soil. "They're working. I don't see anything." "That's because the important work happens underground first." Ethan looked across the empty field. Carl smiled. "Be patient." 3 days later, Ethan walked outside just after sunrise. Something caught his attention immediately. The field looked different. He walked closer. Then he saw it. Tiny green shoots, thousands of them, breaking through the soil. For a moment, he simply stared. After months of work, something was finally growing. The farm was alive. A feeling of excitement rushed through him. He knelt beside one of the small plants. It wasn't impressive, barely a few inches tall. Yet to Ethan, it looked like a miracle. The forgotten field was no longer forgotten. It was growing again. As autumn continued, the crops flourished. Each week brought visible changes. The plants grew taller. The fields became greener. The land that once looked abandoned now looked productive. Travelers passing on nearby roads began slowing down. Many remembered how the farm looked just a year earlier. Now they saw something completely different. Life. One afternoon, Ethan noticed a car parked near the road. An elderly woman stood beside it. She watched the fields quietly. Ethan approached, she smiled. "I haven't seen crops growing here in 20 years." Ethan nodded. "It's been a while." The woman looked across the farm. "Your grandfather would be proud." Then she climbed back into her car and drove away. The words stayed with Ethan all day. Maybe she was right. Maybe his grandfather would be proud. Then came another challenge. Not a storm, not a flood, a drought. For nearly a month, rain refused to fall. The ground began drying out. Cracks appeared in parts of the field. Each day, temperatures climbed higher. The crops started showing signs of stress. Ethan grew concerned. Every evening, he checked weather forecasts. Nothing. Day after day, no rain. The irrigation system helped, but only partially. The farm needed water, real rain, the kind no machine could replace. As the drought continued, worry spread throughout the farming community. Many farmers feared losing part of their harvest. Some feared losing all of it. One evening, Ethan sat on the porch watching the sunset. The fields looked beautiful, yet he knew danger was growing. Without rain, everything could change. Carl arrived shortly before dark. The older farmer sat beside him. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "What if we lose it?" Carl looked toward the horizon. "We might." The answer surprised Ethan. "You really think so?" Carl nodded. "Farming doesn't come with guarantees." The words weren't comforting, but they were honest. Carl stood and prepared to leave. Then he paused. Tomorrow morning. What about it? Sunrise. Carl smiled. Be outside. The next morning, Ethan woke before dawn. The sky remained dark. A cool breeze drifted across the property. Something felt different. He stepped onto the porch. Clouds, large clouds covering the horizon. Minutes later, thunder rolled in the distance. Ethan couldn't believe it. Rain was coming. By mid-morning, the first drops began falling. Then more. Then hundreds. Then thousands. Rain covered the farm. The dry soil eagerly absorbed every drop. The crops seemed to come alive. Ethan stood in the middle of the field getting completely soaked. For the first time in weeks, he laughed. The drought was over. The harvest still had a chance. The weeks that followed were among the most rewarding of Ethan's life. The crops matured beautifully. Golden fields stretched across the landscape. The farm looked magnificent. People throughout the community noticed. Some even stopped to congratulate him. The same people who once doubted him now praised his determination. But Ethan understood something important. The praise wasn't the reward. The reward was standing in those fields, seeing the results of countless hours of effort, watching dreams become reality, watching growth emerge from struggle. Finally, harvest season arrived, the moment Ethan had worked toward since inheriting the farm. Before sunrise, he stood beside the combine. The cool autumn air filled his lungs. Golden crops swayed gently in the breeze. The field seemed endless. For a moment, he remembered how it looked when he first arrived. Overgrown, broken, forgotten. Now it stood ready. He climbed into the machine, started the engine, and began harvesting. The combine moved slowly through the field. Golden grain poured into the tank hour after hour, row after row. The harvest continued. By sunset, Ethan parked the machine and climbed down. The first harvest was complete. It wasn't the biggest harvest in the county. It wasn't record-breaking, but it was his. The first harvest from the forgotten field in nearly 20 years. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, Ethan stood quietly beside the field. The cool evening breeze moved through the remaining stalks. Everything felt peaceful. For the first time since arriving, he realized something. The farm had changed, but so had he. The man who inherited the farm months earlier had been uncertain, doubtful, and lost. The man standing in the field now was different, stronger, more patient, more determined. The forgotten field had taught him lessons no classroom ever could. And as darkness settled across the farm, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. Greater opportunities lay ahead, greater challenges too. Tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, the forgotten field had produced its first harvest, and that was enough. End of chapter 3, the first harvest. Forgotten Field. Chapter 4, The Offer. Winter arrived earlier than expected. The first frost covered the fields in silver. Each morning, Ethan stepped outside to find the farm sparkling beneath the rising sun. The harvest had been completed weeks ago, and for the first time since inheriting the property, he felt something unfamiliar. Stability. The farm wasn't thriving yet. It wasn't making huge profits, but it was surviving. And that was more than anyone had expected, including him. The grain from the harvest had been sold, the equipment was maintained, the bills were paid, there was even a little money left over. Not much, but enough to continue improving the farm. For Ethan, that felt like a victory. The forgotten field had finally begun supporting itself. One cold morning, he sat at the kitchen table reviewing expenses. The farmhouse was quiet. Outside, a gentle snow drifted across the fields. Everything seemed peaceful. Then a knock came at the door. Ethan opened it to find a man standing on the porch. The stranger wore an expensive coat and polished boots. A black SUV sat in the driveway. The vehicle looked completely out of place on the farm. "Mr. Carter?" the man asked. "That's me." The stranger extended his hand. "My name is Richard Lawson." Ethan shook it. "Can I help you?" Richard smiled. "I certainly hope so." A few minutes later, they sat at the kitchen table. Richard placed a folder on the surface. The man's confidence filled the room. He looked around the farmhouse with curiosity. "Beautiful property." Ethan nodded. "It has potential." Richard smiled. "I agree." He opened the folder. Inside were maps, property surveys, development plans. Ethan's stomach tightened. Something felt wrong. Richard slid one of the documents forward. The company has been purchasing land throughout the region. Ethan studied the map. Several neighboring properties were highlighted. What kind of company? Commercial development. The answer immediately explained everything. Richard leaned back. "We're planning a major project, a logistics center, a transportation hub, a large investment for the area." Ethan looked at the highlighted properties. The farm sat directly in the center. Richard folded his hands. "We'd like to purchase your land." The room became silent. Ethan stared at the map. For months, he had fought to save the farm. Now someone wanted to buy it. Not because it was failing, because it was valuable. Richard pushed another paper across the table. The offer. Ethan's eyes widened. The number was enormous. Far more money than he expected. More money than he had ever seen. Richard smiled. "It's a generous proposal." Generous wasn't the right word. Life-changing was. Ethan could pay off every debt, buy a house, start over anywhere he wanted. The offer represented freedom, security, opportunity, everything most people spent their lives chasing. Richard stood. "I don't need an answer today." He handed Ethan a business card. "Take some time." Then he smiled. "But don't take too long." The man walked outside. Moments later, the SUV disappeared down the road, leaving Ethan alone with the offer. That night, sleep refused to come. The papers remained spread across the kitchen table. Ethan stared at them for hours. The number never changed. Neither did the temptation. Selling made sense. Financially, it was the smartest decision possible. Most people would accept immediately. The farm still required years of work. There were no guarantees. Another storm could arrive. Another drought. Another setback. Selling would eliminate every risk. Yet, something bothered him. Every time he imagined signing the papers, he felt uneasy. He couldn't explain why. The next morning, he drove into town. News traveled quickly. By lunchtime, everyone seemed to know about the offer. Opinions came from every direction. "You'd be crazy not to sell. Take the money." Nobody turns down an opportunity like that. Even people who supported his farming efforts encouraged him to accept. The answer appeared obvious to everyone. Everyone except Ethan. That afternoon, he visited Carl Henderson. The older farmer listened quietly as Ethan explained everything. When he finished, Carl remained silent. "What would you do?" Ethan asked. Carl shrugged. "Doesn't matter. It matters to me." Carl looked out the window. "No." He turned toward Ethan. "What matters is what you want." Ethan sighed. "I don't know." Carl smiled. "Then you're asking the wrong question." "What do you mean?" The older farmer stood. He grabbed his coat. "Come with me." They drove to a hill overlooking the valley. Several farms stretched across the landscape. Snow covered the fields. Smoke rose from distant chimneys. The entire countryside looked peaceful. Carl pointed toward the horizon. "See those farms?" Ethan nodded. "My grandfather worked some of them. My father worked some of them. Families built lives there." The older farmer paused. "Some sold. Some stayed." Carl looked directly at Ethan. Neither choice was wrong. The wind moved through the grass around them. Carl continued. "The real question isn't how much the land is worth. It's what the land means." Ethan looked across the valley. His grandfather's words returned. "Spend one season here. That season had become much more. The farm wasn't simply property anymore. It was memories, lessons, failures, victories, growth. It had become part of him. Days passed, the deadline approached. Richard called twice. Each time Ethan asked for more time. The pressure continued building. Part of him wanted the security. Another part wanted the farm. The conflict consumed him. Then something happened. One evening he entered the barn. The old tractor sat exactly where he had parked it. The same tractor his grandfather had driven. The same tractor that almost never ran again. Ethan climbed into the seat. A familiar smell filled the air. For a moment he remembered being a child, sitting beside his grandfather, listening to stories, learning about patience, learning about hard work, learning about purpose. His eyes moved across the barn. Every repair, every improvement, every challenge, he had fought for all of it. Not because it was easy, because it mattered. Suddenly the answer became clear. The following morning, Richard Lawson arrived. The black SUV pulled into the driveway. Confidence filled his expression. He clearly expected good news. The two men sat across from one another. Richard smiled. "Have you reached a decision?" Ethan nodded. "I have." Richard leaned forward. "Excellent." For a moment, the room remained silent. Then Ethan slid the paperwork back across the table. Unsigned. Richard's smile faded. "You aren't selling?" "No." The businessman stared at him, almost shocked. "You understand how much money you're walking away from?" "Yes," Richard shook his head. "I don't understand." Ethan looked out the window. Beyond the glass stretched the fields, covered in snow, waiting for spring, waiting for another season, waiting for another chance to grow. He smiled. "You don't have to." Richard gathered the papers. His disappointment was obvious. Before leaving, he paused at the door. Most people would have taken the offer. Ethan nodded. "I know." The SUV disappeared down the road for the final time. This time, Ethan felt no doubt, no uncertainty, no regret, only peace. That evening, he stood on the porch watching the sunset. The sky glowed with brilliant shades of orange and purple. The farm stretched quietly before him, still imperfect, still unfinished, still demanding work. Yet it was his. For the first time, Ethan truly understood why his grandfather never gave up on the land. Some things couldn't be measured in dollars. Some things were worth more. As darkness settled over the forgotten field, Ethan looked toward the horizon. Spring would arrive soon. New challenges would come with it. New opportunities, new dreams. The journey was far from over. In many ways, it was only beginning. And for the first time, Ethan knew exactly where he belonged. End of chapter 4, The Offer.